For thousands of years, sailors have feared the same ancient enemy, an enemy without a face, without a voice, and without mercy. The sea. To those who make their living on the water, the sea is a god. A force older than history itself. A place that gives life, and takes it without hesitation. And sometimes, the sea takes more than lives. Sometimes, it takes an entire ship, swallowing it so completely that not a single piece of wood, rope, or metal ever returns. A vanishing so total, so absolute, that even the most seasoned captains can only whisper a single word. Ghost ship. But among all tales of ghost ships, there is one story that stands above the rest. A story so strange, so impossible, so deeply unsettling, that even today, nearly a century later, experts still cannot explain it. It begins with a crew of 23 men. Experienced sailors, hardened by storms, by sleepless nights, by the endless rhythm of waves slamming against steel. Men who trusted one another with their lives. Men who believed they had seen everything the ocean could offer. They were wrong. The day they departed the harbor, the weather was calm. Clear skies. Steady winds. Perfect conditions for a long voyage. Fishermen along the docks waved them off, unaware that this would be the last time anyone would see the crew alive. The ship cut through the water with confidence, its engines humming, its crew performing their duties like clockwork. Nothing, absolutely nothing, hinted at the nightmare that was approaching. But the sea has its moods. And when it turns fast. The first strange sign came not from the weather, but from the men themselves. A few sailors later reported that as the ship left the coastline, they felt something, a heaviness, a pressure, a sense that the ocean was watching them. A superstition, perhaps. A chill carried by the wind. Or something else entirely. One man wrote in his journal. The sea feels restless today, like it knows something we don't. Those were some of his last recorded words. Within 48 hours, the ship would vanish completely. No distress call. No emergency signal. Just silence. A silence so deep that it felt intentional, as if something had reached up from beneath the waves and pulled the vessel into another world. But here is where the story becomes truly impossible. 9 days after disappearing. The ship returned. No damage. No signs of a struggle. No crew. Just an empty vessel drifting toward shore as if guided by invisible hands. It looked untouched. Preserved. Waiting. A ship without men. A ship without answers. A ship that should have sunk, but didn't. This is the beginning of one of the greatest maritime mysteries in human history. A story of disappearance, dread, and the unexplainable. A story that challenges everything we think we know about the sea. And perhaps, everything we know about the world itself. Before the ship vanished, it carried a crew of 23 men, sailors described as disciplined, methodical, and deeply experienced. They had worked together for years, forming a unit that operated with near-military precision. Their captain, a man in his late 40s, was known for his calm leadership and an almost obsessive respect for maritime safety. He had weathered countless storms and navigated dangerous routes with a reputation for caution, not risk. The crew was diverse. Engineers familiar with the ship's machinery. Navigation specialists. Radio operators. And deckhands skilled in reading the tides and winds. Many had grown up near the sea. A few had fathers and grandfathers who were sailors before them. These were not men who panicked easily. They were professionals. Investigators later reviewed their personnel files and medical histories. No signs of mental instability. No behavioral concerns. No internal conflict. The crew was stable, healthy, and prepared for the voyage. Hours before departure, several men were seen joking on the dock. A few bought extra tobacco. Others mailed letters home. Everything pointed to a typical beginning of a routine journey. But in hindsight, one detail stands out. Multiple witnesses later reported that the crew seemed quieter than usual. Not fearful, just unusually reserved. One dockworker recalled a brief exchange with the captain. When asked about the weather, the captain reportedly said, "The forecast is clear, but something feels strange out there." When pressed, he added nothing more. He simply finished the inspection, signed the departure papers, and boarded the vessel. This comment was written down in the official investigative notes, circled twice by the lead examiner. It remains one of the few recorded hints that someone on board sensed something out of the ordinary before the disappearance. The ship departed in perfect condition. All equipment tested. Fuel tanks full. Radio functioning. No mechanical issues. The voyage began with smooth seas, consistent winds, and visibility that stretched for miles. In fact, early radio logs show normal communication for the first 36 hours, routine status reports, unchanged navigation routes, nothing unusual. But what makes this detail crucial is simple. A crew this experienced, traveling in such ideal conditions, should have been among the least likely to vanish. No distress call. No malfunction recorded. No emergency response. For 23 trained sailors to disappear without leaving behind a single clue defies every established pattern in maritime history. The investigation would later label the crew's disappearance as unprecedented. Not only because they vanished, but because everything before their final moments suggested absolute normalcy. And when a disaster strikes without warning, without pattern, without physical evidence, it becomes nearly impossible to reconstruct what truly happened. But the sea leaves traces, even when it tries not to. And in the next stage of the journey, we begin to see those traces emerge. The last known communication from the ship came at 1842 hours on the second day of its journey. It was a short message, almost routine in tone, but subtle details would later trouble investigators for decades. The transmission read: "Fog setting in. Visibility low. Will report again in 2 hours." The voice of the radio operator, identified as a 27-year-old sailor trained in naval communication, sounded calm. There was no background noise indicating distress. No alarms. No shouts. No indication of chaos. Just a man performing his duty, reporting a change in weather conditions. Yet meteorological records from that region showed no fog at all. Not that evening. Not in any surrounding areas. The skies were clear. How could the crew be surrounded by fog, when no other ship reported the same? Some experts suggested the possibility of a localized fog bank, which can appear unexpectedly. Others proposed temperature inversion, an atmospheric condition that can cause sudden dense fog in isolated pockets. But neither theory fully explains the radio operator's final comment. Because investigators noted something else. The words, "fog setting in," were repeated twice in the ship's log. Almost as if the writer was unsure. Or trying to describe something he had never seen before. The final message, "will report again in 2 hours," was standard procedure. But that follow-up message never came. No distress call. No interference. No panic in the voice. Just silence. Experts reviewing the audio decades later described an unusual echo, like the sound waves were traveling through a heavy, damp atmosphere. Sound distortion consistent with extreme humidity. Or something else entirely. When the ship failed to check in that night, authorities initially assumed a minor radio malfunction. Failures were common in this period: saltwater corrosion, loose wiring, battery depletion. But by the next morning, when multiple attempts to reach the crew were ignored, the ship was declared non-responsive. Potentially overdue. Search vessels were deployed. But the ocean is vast, and a ship can drift tens of miles in a single night. The search grid expanded rapidly, yet not a single trace was found. The radio logs show dozens of unanswered hails. Respond if able. Confirm position. Do you require assistance? Each message echoed into an empty sea. The crew's final recorded words became the cornerstone of the investigation. Fog. Low visibility. A promised message that never came. But what happened between that transmission and the moment the ship vanished? Without survivors, without a distress call, and without physical damage, investigators could only rely on that last voice. A calm man describing a fog no one else could see. Moments before an entire vessel disappeared from the surface of the Earth. On the morning of the third day, weather reports from the region changed drastically. A storm system formed unexpectedly, building rapidly into a violent maritime disturbance. Waves rose to over 10 meters. Wind speeds reached levels capable of tearing sails and damaging engines. Nearby ships struggled. Several reported near capsizing. A few were forced to turn back to port. But the missing ship was already unresponsive long before the storm hit. This detail is crucial. The vessel did not vanish because of the storm. It vanished before the storm formed. Still, the storm complicated everything. The rescue efforts became nearly impossible. Visibility dropped. Currents shifted unpredictably. Search grids expanded as winds carried the ship further off its projected path. For 2 days, authorities believed the ship had sunk during the storm. The logic seemed sound. Powerful waves, heavy winds, and shifting pressure could overwhelm a vessel of its size. In fact, the official maritime report issued on day 5 stated: probability of survival, 0%. Assumed lost with all hands. Families were notified. Newspapers ran headlines. Ship lost at sea. Crew of 23 presumed dead. By all historical standards, the case should have ended there. But then, anomalies surfaced. The storm left debris trails from multiple vessels damaged in its path, wood fragments, life rings, crates. Yet from the missing ship, nothing. Not a plank. Not a barrel. Not a single rope or flotation device. Ships that sink leave traces. The sea rarely swallows anything completely. Yet this vessel left nothing. Some experts suggested that the storm carried the debris deep underwater. Others argued that the ship may have capsized and sunk intact. But none of these theories hold when compared to what happened 9 days later. Because a ship that sinks cannot simply return. What followed defied all known patterns in maritime disappearance. And to understand the magnitude of this anomaly, we must examine what happened on the 9th day. When something impossible emerged from the horizon. 9 days after the ship vanished, at dawn, the horizon revealed a dark silhouette drifting toward shore. Local fishermen were the first to see it. From a distance, they assumed it was debris from the storm. A broken hull, perhaps, or parts of a damaged vessel. But something was off. The object moved too steadily. Too smoothly. As if guided by intentional steering. As light grew stronger, shapes became clearer. The fishermen realized, with mounting disbelief, that the object was not debris. It was the missing ship. The one declared sunk. The one given up for dead. It was drifting calmly. Upright. Fully intact. When authorities arrived, they confirmed a detail that astonished experts. The ship had no visible damage. No broken mast. No cracked hull. No waterline breaches. It was as if the ship had been sheltered from the storm entirely. Even though its projected route placed it directly in the storm's path. Marine engineers conducted a preliminary inspection and concluded that the vessel could not have endured such severe weather without bearing at least minor marks. Scratches, dents, salt accumulation. But the ship bore none. The engines were idle but functional. Navigation instruments worked. Fuel levels were near full. It was not a battered survivor returning from a violent encounter. It was a ship that looked as if nothing had happened. The only thing missing was the crew. 23 men. Gone without a trace. No lifeboats were missing. No signs of struggle. No signs of forced abandonment. The vessel simply returned alone. This moment, the ship drifting in perfect condition, became one of the most puzzling maritime events ever recorded. A disappearance followed by an immaculate return. Over the next hours, investigators boarded the ship, expecting answers. Instead, they found deeper mysteries. Because the interior of the ship was even stranger than its miraculous return. When investigators stepped aboard, they expected chaos, fallen equipment, broken crates, waterlogged compartments. But the interior shocked them more than the exterior. Everything was untouched. The deck was clean, free of damage or debris. Cabins were orderly. Beds made. Journals neatly stacked atop desks. Eating utensils still hanging in their racks, unshaken. The engine room was pristine. Tools were organized. Machinery showed no signs of flooding or overheating. There were no broken pipes. No fuel leaks. The radios were functional. The batteries charged. Wiring secure. There was no reason for a communication blackout. Then came the most disturbing discovery. All lifeboats were still attached. Not one had been deployed. Not one had even been loosened. Abandoning a ship without lowering lifeboats is unheard of. It violates every maritime survival protocol. Even in sudden emergencies, explosions, fires, enemy attack, crews instinctively reach for lifeboats. But here, they remained untouched. Medical kits were unopened. Weapons were still locked in storage. Food supplies untouched. It was as if the men simply stood up, walked to the deck, and vanished overboard. But that scenario defies logic. These were trained sailors. They understood the ocean. They would never abandon a functioning vessel in calm seas. The lead investigator later wrote in his report. There is no rational motive for evacuation. All systems were operational. The ship was in perfect condition. There were no signs of violence. No blood. No bullet holes. No damage consistent with piracy. There was no fire. No smoke. No chemical leak. The ship was, in every measurable way, completely normal. Except for one glaring fact. 23 men had vanished without leaving behind even a footprint of their departure. The mystery deepened with every step the investigators took. But the strangest discoveries were yet to come. The central question now consumed the investigation. Where are the men? Every corner of the ship was searched. The cargo hold, engine compartments, storage rooms, crew cabins, even the ballast sections. There were no bodies. No survivors. No hidden compartments. The men were simply gone. Investigators catalogued every item left behind. Personal boots, jackets, pipes, watches, notebooks. These were not the belongings of sailors who planned to abandon ship. If the crew evacuated willingly, they would have taken clothing, water, navigation tools, and personal effects. But everything remained exactly where it should. One detail stood out in particular. Coffee cups on the dining table still contained traces of dried liquid, suggesting the crew disappeared shortly after a meal. Without warning, without preparation. The navigation charts on the table showed their planned route. No changes. No signs of panic or sudden redirection. The crew's last known coordinates were marked neatly, with no emergency annotations. Then investigators reviewed the ship's logs. The final entries were normal. Until the very last line. Unusual fog approaching from the east. Crew uneasy. But all nearby ships reported clear visibility. No fog. No atmospheric anomalies. What, then, did this crew see? Even more unsettling was the condition of the deck. Salt crystals, normally found on ships after storms, were missing. Ropes were perfectly coiled. Barrels were undisturbed. A ship that endured a storm should not look this untouched. This raised a new theory. Perhaps the ship was never in the storm at all. Somehow, it avoided the catastrophic weather. Drifted undamaged. And returned 9 days later in perfect shape. But if the ship survived unscathed, what happened to the men? This question would haunt investigators for decades. Investigators proposed multiple theories to explain the disappearance of the crew. Theory 1, mutiny. Rejected almost immediately. There were no signs of conflict. No missing weapons. No ripped clothing. The crew had no known disputes with the captain or each other. Theory 2, rogue wave. A sudden massive wave washing the crew overboard. But rogue waves leave damage, broken rails, bent metal, missing gear. This ship had none. Theory 3, toxic gas leak. Possibly from the engine room, causing hallucinations or panic. But air quality tests showed no residue of harmful chemicals. Theory 4, food contamination. Spoiled supplies could cause mass illness. But food samples showed no bacteria, mold, or toxins. Theory 5, mass hysteria or psychological event. Experts rejected this. 23 trained sailors do not simultaneously hallucinate without a trigger. Theory 6, lightning strike disabling the crew. No scorch marks. No electrical damage. Theory 7, underwater seismic activity. A sudden shock forcing evacuation. But the hull was intact. Every theory failed under scrutiny. Nothing matched the physical evidence. The lead investigator eventually wrote, "No natural explanation fits all available data." Which left the final category of theories. Those involving rare, and poorly understood, oceanic phenomena. Such as dead calms. Magnetic anomalies. Or infrasound waves. Low-frequency vibrations known to cause panic, confusion, and disorientation in both animals and humans. Some researchers believe the crew may have encountered an extreme infrasound event that triggered mass evacuation. But even this theory fails for a simple reason. Why would trained sailors abandon a perfectly functional ship without taking lifeboats? Theories multiplied, but answers remained elusive. Although the investigation focused on scientific explanations, sailors offered another perspective: the sea has rules humans do not fully understand. Stories passed down through generations speak of silent fogs, of calling waters, of ships that cross into zones where reality bends. These tales, often dismissed as superstition, gained new life after the discovery of the abandoned vessel. Local fishermen reported seeing strange lights on the horizon days before the ship returned. A few claimed they heard low humming sounds coming from beneath the waves. Sounds with no identifiable source. Others described sudden changes in water temperature. Currents shifting in unnatural patterns. And patches of ocean so calm that even birds refused to land. These reports are not scientifically verified. But they are consistent. For centuries, maritime lore has described locations where compasses spin. Fog behaves unnaturally. And sound travels in distorted ways. Could the ship have entered such a zone? One retired captain told investigators. There are places the sea guards. Enter them, and it will take what it wants. While such accounts fall outside the realm of scientific explanation, they reflect centuries of accumulated experience from men who lived their entire lives on the ocean. Investigators did not endorse supernatural theories. But they could not entirely dismiss them either. Because the evidence, the immaculate condition of the ship, the lack of damage, the absence of lifeboat deployment, did not align with any natural maritime phenomenon known at the time. Something happened. Something no one could explain. The turning point in the investigation came when analysts examined the ship's logbook. The final written entry read: "The sea is whispering. Crew uneasy." The phrase, "sea is whispering," was unprecedented. No sailor uses this language in official documentation. The handwriting was shaky, inconsistent, unusual for an experienced officer. Graphologists concluded that the writer was under psychological stress. Not panic, but unease. The entry also referenced a fog approaching from the east. A fog no other ship had reported. Satellite weather reconstruction decades later showed no atmospheric changes in the region at that time. So what fog did the crew see? The logbook contained another odd detail. The ink on the final entry was smudged. As if the pen slipped or the writer's hand trembled. The timestamp was blurred. Not erased, blurred. Investigators tested the ink. It was consistent with the period. But humidity levels on the page were abnormally high. As if the book had been exposed to moisture. Yet the surrounding room was dry. The final entry's tone, phrasing, and physical anomalies suggest the crew encountered something that defied their understanding. Whether natural or unnatural remains unknown. For thousands of years, sailors have feared the same ancient enemy, an enemy without a face, without a voice, and without mercy. The sea. To those who make their living on the water, the sea is a god. A force older than history itself. A place that gives life, and takes it without hesitation. And sometimes, the sea takes more than lives. Sometimes, it takes an entire ship, swallowing it so completely that not a single piece of wood, rope, or metal ever returns. A vanishing so total, so absolute, that even the most seasoned captains can only whisper a single word. Ghost ship. But among all tales of ghost ships, there is one story that stands above the rest. A story so strange, so impossible, so deeply unsettling, that even today, nearly a century later, experts still cannot explain it. It begins with a crew of 23 men. Experienced sailors, hardened by storms, by sleepless nights, by the endless rhythm of waves slamming against steel. Men who trusted one another with their lives. Men who believed they had seen everything the ocean could offer. They were wrong. The day they departed the harbor, the weather was calm. Clear skies. Steady winds. Perfect conditions for a long voyage. Fishermen along the docks waved them off, unaware that this would be the last time anyone would see the crew alive. The ship cut through the water with confidence, its engines humming, its crew performing their duties like clockwork. Nothing, absolutely nothing, hinted at the nightmare that was approaching. But the sea has its moods. And when it turns fast. The first strange sign came not from the weather, but from the men themselves. A few sailors later reported that as the ship left the coastline, they felt something, a heaviness, a pressure, a sense that the ocean was watching them. A superstition, perhaps. A chill carried by the wind. Or something else entirely. One man wrote in his journal. "The sea feels restless today, like it knows something we don't." Those were some of his last recorded words. Within 48 hours, the ship would vanish completely. No distress call. No emergency signal. Just silence. A silence so deep that it felt intentional, as if something had reached up from beneath the waves and pulled the vessel into another world. But here is where the story becomes truly impossible. 9 days after disappearing, the ship returned. No damage. No signs of a struggle. No crew. Just an empty vessel drifting toward shore as if guided by invisible hands. It looked untouched. Preserved. Waiting. A ship without men. A ship without answers. A ship that should have sunk, but didn't. This is the beginning of one of the greatest maritime mysteries in human history. A story of disappearance, dread, and the unexplainable. A story that challenges everything we think we know about the sea. And perhaps, everything we know about the world itself.